Hello and welcome to our second episode where we are trying to overlook and see if social media is controlling our societies. Now, there is an overarching theme of our podcast. It's going to be to bring evidence that is reliable and prove that social media algorithms do, in fact, control our societies. The previous episode, was on the social media algorithms themselves. This episode, we're going to talk more about bias and algorithms. My name is Mohammed.
My name is Wahid. And my name is Saad.
All right, and to start, again, we have specialist books just in case the viewers forgot about them. I'm going to introduce Weapons of Mass Destruction real quick. The book is written by Cathy O'Neill, and it delves into the dark side of big data. It was published in 2016 and it explores how the use of mathematical models and algorithms, which are often perceived as objective and unbiased, can reinforce discrimination in society. Cathy O'Neill is a data scientist and a mathematician, and she argues that many of the algorithms used in areas like finance, policing, and employment screening are opaque and unregulated black boxes, which makes decisions that can have serious consequences on people's lives. Your guys' book, again, is The Antisocial. You want to
Yep.
describe it a bit?
Yep. So our book then is titled "Anti-Social Media: How Facebook Undermines Social Democracy." And essentially, the main premise of our book is that the author basically makes the main argument that Facebook is basically a platform that undermines and or weakens the democracy of people by introducing things such as a bubble filter or other forms of AI sort of restriction that sort of limits the amount of views sort of they ingest, and kind of through the bubble filter we see that they're kind of limited to like this one view and they get it over and over. And yeah, that's our book, and there's many different other algorithmic ways that he underlines about
Yes.
how AI uh, surveils us and like basically learns about us and does other things to us. Yeah.
All right. So my specialist books was The Race After Technology. It was written by Ruha Benjamin, and it's an insightful exploration on how technology often reinforces racial biases and inequalities. Benjamin is a scholar in the field of race and technology. She argues that the digital world is not immune to social problems of the offline world. She delves into the concept of the new Jim Code, highlighting how technology can appear neutral at first look, but in reality it can help and grow biases. The book covers a range of topics from automated decision making in criminal justice to biased facial recognition software, demonstrating how these technologies can deepen social divides. Benjamin calls for a more inclusive approach to technology design and advocates for a future where technology supports social justice and equality. This book is a critical read for anyone interested in the intersection of race, technology, and society. All right, so before we begin, this podcast is the second that we ever make, right? And we still haven't got the feedback on the first podcast.
Yep.
So we're operating a bit on a blind decision. We don't have a lot of feedback to go. So
We are assuming that we did well on the first
of course, but if there appears to be mistakes or some inconsistencies in this podcast as well, please forgive us. It's our second episode to do ever. Before we begin, let's start by introducing what bias is. So I'm gonna give you a little analogy. So imagine that we're going into a very old house, and I tell you the facts about it that it was built probably in the 1900s, very early, and it was built out of wood and it went through very various dangerous hurricanes. Right? We go there at night and we hear a creaking noise. What's your guys' first thought of that voice? Where does it come from?
Mm,
For me, I would be thinking about what you said about the hurricane situation and like is it possible that there's a hurricane?
yeah, I definitely look towards making like
I
like a background sort of like research type of thing before
Mhm.
concluding that maybe it's like a ghost or something or like something
Mhm.
supernatural.
Because
So
with the rise of technology now, like we have access to weather data, so we can make a more rational
Exactly.
uh,
mhm.
um,
Decision.
decision about this. But if we didn't have access to it, then when you told us like, oh, like
Mhm.
there's a lot of hurricanes in this region, of course, my first reaction is like I would try to look outside, like, is there a hurricane right now? So yeah,
And
that's
you guys made that decision out of the just the facts that I told you, right?
Of course.
So you called out
solely
the
impacted by what you said.
exactly. So you brought out ghosts, for example.
For sure.
So now if we go to that same house, but I tell you that during the First World War, there was an entire family that got killed uh, because of various reasons in the war or whatever.
Mhm.
And now we go at night and you hear that same noise.
Mhm.
Now, knowing that beforehand, we went onto a website that told us there is a lot of ghost activity in
Mhm.
this house. What would you believe that creaking noise would be afterwards?
I think from just like the amount of evidence that it has pointing towards like that ghost theory, I guess,
Mhm.
I would start to believe that a little bit more. And as well, like you're kind of like living the experience there as well, and you're kind of like the ghost stories and stuff.
Mhm.
You're kind of experiencing it while you're there as well. So I
Yeah,
feel like
Mhm.
your mind sort of plays into it a bit. If that
yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, of course.
The bias really starts to affect you when the story aligns and is credible.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, so this is part of what happens with bias. We're given context that specific algorithms want us to take from it, and
Mhm.
sometimes it can feed into a feedback loop, like the ghost story, for example.
Yeah,
Since we knew there's ghost stories that happen in that house, we went in expecting to find ghost appearances, right?
yeah,
So when we go back to report on that website, yes, we found a creaking noise, for example.
yeah,
We're gonna associate it with a ghost rather than the old house just being creaky and old.
yeah.
For sure.
All right, so that kinda gives an idea of what biases is. We're gonna move on to the nature of algorithm bias. So in my book, um, sorry, we're gonna first talk about the weapons of math destruction. So algorithmic bias in the context of social media, as discussed in Weapons of Math Destruction, refers to the way algorithms can inadvertently or deliberately influence existing social biases and inequalities. Social media platforms use algorithms to personalize content, target advertisement, and curate news feeds. These algorithms often rely on large sets of data that include historical user behaviors, preferences, and interactions. And this is something that your book also talks about, all right? So, taking the bubble filter, I remember, was from podcast one.
Hmm.
So,
Oh yeah,
do,
for sure. The mobile filter then again, it's something that introduces bias upon people because it
mm,
essentially influences like the decision making and like the thought process.
Yeah,
Um, Basically, what the bubble filter again, as brought up by the antisocial media book, does all is again the algorithms basically sort of create a profile for you and they kind of assign a group to you,
mhm.
and through this group they keep the same views and they make them reoccurring in your feed so
Yes,
that you see them often, and that sort of influences you to align with them a bit more.
yes.
And that definitely produces bias for sure. So
mm,
that's definitely a way that biases are
Yeah.
produced.
And the one thing that I also notice is that when we have these kind of bubble filters affecting our lives, we
Mm.
are more um, prone to being in a situation where we're stuck in an echo chamber
Mm.
where yes we had some certain beliefs and maybe if we saw the opinion like a different opinion on that beliefs then we would change it,
Mm-hmm.
but because of this constant bubble filter predicting our future activities we're always going to be stuck within this echo chamber that we've kind of created for ourselves. And it's very difficult to also see different point of views to also grow because part of learning is,
Mm.
changing our opinions on subjects and um,
Yeah,
which also affects our own opinion.
yeah, and for sure. And when we don't get those views, we're obviously going to be aligned to this certain bias that we're presented. And this
Mhm.
all aligns to basically just a propaganda as well. a lot of like social information and propaganda obviously introduces bias again. And again, the same thing as propaganda. If we're not getting different views and different opinions, we're obviously going to be aligned to the propaganda that's pushed.
Mhm.
Yeah, this also like overlaps with some of the concepts in Race After Technology book. So the new Jim Code that is introduced in the book focuses on the way in which racism is embedded in the design, implementation, and the usage of technology. This includes the automated systems and biases, facial recognition and surveillance, digital divide, which is the concept extends in the broader issue of digital access and literacy. And finally, it's the invisibility and erasure, erasing the whatever you like. So like the biases that introduced in this book kinda is saying that it erases whatever context we have as
Mhm.
personality,
Yeah.
and it just is building on whatever the algorithms want you to have.
Mm.
And that's basically what like the book talks about in the nature of algorithm bias.
Mhm.
We could move on to the next point that we have. We have the manifestation of algorithmic bias in social media, and there are many cases in my book, for example. So those examples showcased biases in our modern technology. And the first one that Ruha Benjamin brings is discriminatory ad targeting. And Benjamin discusses how instances where social media algorithms have enabled advertisers to target or exclude users based on race, gender, and other characteristics. For example, there have been cases where housing ads were selectively shown to certain racial groups, excluding others and violating fair house laws. Another example was shown is the content moderation of racial bias. The book also highlights how content moderation algorithms can disproportionately flag and remove content from minority users.
Mhm.
This bias stems from the training data used by these algorithms, which may not
Adequately.
adequately
Yeah.
represent diverse linguistics and cultural contexts. And the final one that I want to bring is the biased algorithmic recommendations. Benjamin points out how recommendations algorithms on social media platforms can grow stereotypes. For instance, users might be recommended content, groups, or connections that reinforce racial bias or stereotypes, contributing to the segregated online experience.
Mhm.
That's right.
That
Yes.
that falls again with bubble filter again. That
Mm,
could be an example of how bubble filter plays a part. Because again, if you're getting promoted content that is again racially biased, then just by their algorithmic filter, you're
Mhm.
going to be recommending that content more and more. So you're kind of narrowing your field of view essentially
Yes.
into these
mhm.
problems, which are
And
Okay.
also,
negative. Yeah.
yeah, and also like it brings the issues of like the rise of extremist viewpoints
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
because these, even though these groups are very extremist and they're not um, a proper um, representation of what reality might be in the real world, they are stuck in their echo chamber that keeps their opinion loud, but they don't ever have a chance to see different opinions or see different or talk with different people that have
Mm-hmm.
different values to have a more healthy
Mm-hmm.
communication and growth experience because always getting the same information over and over, um, it really
You
makes
again just
you
limit
grow
your
into
view.
an
Yeah.
extremist mindset that you're very stuck in that viewpoint that you have, and you'll have a harder and harder time seeing the opinions and views of other people.
Sure.
Yeah, so that also like aligns with what we brought in lectures and what is written in Weapons of Mass Destruction. So,
Hmm.
for example, we can bring the example of predictive policing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Predictive policing is an algorithm which is used to forecast where crimes might occur, and often relies on historical crime data. This data can be biased due to the over policing in minority neighborhoods,
Yeah.
which leads to self-perpetuating cycle, or someone might call it a positive feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
There are also the um, example given in Weapons of Mass Destruction is the bias in sentencing algorithms. So the book says that the use of algorithm in the criminal justice system for risk assessment are algorithms that can incorporate biased data, such as zip codes or family criminal history,
Mm-hmm.
leading to a harsher sentencing for minorities.
That's right.
And the last one I think we also covered in class is the impact on employment, such as like the employment ratings based on biases, like your ethnicity, where you studied, where you lived, and whatnot. So all these examples underscore the need for more responsible and transparent algorithm designs and taking into account the diverse and complex nature of human societies. They highlight how unchecked algorithm biases can not only build on existing social inequalities but also create new forms of discrimination and injustice.
Mm-hmm. This
Uh,
also relates to Stephanie Wickstra from What is Fair? Algorithms in Criminal Justice, where she was explaining that these algorithms, they're not public. It's very hard to hold these algorithms into account. Uh, and they definitely do have some biases towards some um, minorities. Um, and it's very difficult. It's a very difficult problem to tackle, and it also ties to that feedback loop, right? Because we are prosecuting minorities, which leads to data being more on the side that minorities are causing crime, and then these algorithms are learning this data.
Our data set
And
essentially becomes skewed.
yeah, we have skewed data, and it perpetuates uh, these biases in society that, for example, like minorities would be causing more crimes when in reality is just the data samples or the data set that we are using to base these kind of opinions on the algorithms that we are using. And this is very bad because these algorithms, they are used to decide whether people can go back into society or stay in jail while awaiting their trial. And we all know that this plays a big part into winning a case because somebody who's able to go back to their house is going to be in a much healthier mindset than someone who's stuck in prison worrying about their case and where it's going to go.
For sure.
And it's not giving a fair trial if we think about it in that sense.
For sure, this is like a life changing like thing. So I definitely think
Mm-hmm.
needs to be a lot more attention paid to this because you're looking at some, like literally a weapon of mass destruction, as Cathy points out, because you're essentially looking at ruining someone's life basically, which is the damage aspect of it, and could definitely be scaled up for sure. And again, the model isn't readily available to the public.
Yeah, and that's a real issue because these companies that the government is employing to do these kind of risk assessments on people that they're accusing of crimes, which is a key here. They're accusing them, so they're not even being assessed by a judge. They don't have a fair trial. It's just this black box that's assigning them a score of how likely they're going to be causing a crime if the police are letting them out on bail. And this is really hurtful to society in so many ways.
Another thing with just the data sets is I feel like a lot of what the data is provided is based a lot of on what history is, and I feel as though history itself is not
Inherently biased.
fully biased. It's written by the oppressors and the people who have won, basically.
That's right.
And
We never get the side of the picture of
for sure,
the other people.
I think no matter what data set you use, there's always going to be some sort of bias that's always introduced, no matter what you do. As history's just been rooted that way.
All right, so we could move on to the impact of bias on society and democracy.
Sure.
Do you guys think that social media has a bias in terms of democratic decisions, and does it influence, let's say, our next elections or something?
Oh, for sure.
Of course,
We
definitely.
had a section in our book where we were talking about Cambridge and Analytica last podcast as well. Social media definitely plays a big part. I believe Philip was talking about how Cambridge Analytica got a bunch of voters to shift in favor of Donald Trump, I believe it was, or the other.
Yes. So yes, that's what Cambridge Analytica did. They basically created a psyche map of the
Mm-hmm.
United States to find where they could um, pressure a bit with advertisements to find out if they would be able to make this region vote in favor of one party or another. And I also think it's not just Cambridge Analytica, although these kind of companies do play a
For
big
sure.
part in it, but also uh, I think because of the rise of social media and biases created by social media,
Hmm.
we are led into a situation where
Hmm.
politics gets more and more extreme
Hmm.
because, as to what I said previously, these biases they create echo chambers where
Hmm.
certain people are going to vote for certain political parties, and then they are joining these clubs or group chats that
Hmm.
perpetuate these the same rhetorics that they
Hmm.
believe in, and these beliefs really become entrenched
Hmm.
in the people that
Yeah,
they
and
have in these groups.
example of this the whole echo chamber thing going out of control can be like the Capitol Hill riots, where these groups all
Yes,
got together and started to basically cause havoc.
that's right. We get to these really, or even if you guys heard of like Andrew Tate
Hmm.
on online night, yeah, and you get those really like extremist viewpoints that like are not at all a good reflection of how the real world is and real people are. Um,
Hmm.
and you really get those very extremist viewpoints, and this really ties into
Hmm.
politics because what is the foundation of a healthy democratic society,
Hmm.
right? It's one that can exchange ideas and grow and learn from different viewpoints. We
Hmm.
are not benefiting from groups that are becoming more and more extreme in their viewpoint. This just undermines society because people are not open to debate or
Hmm.
discussions with people that hold different
Hmm.
types of values or
It's
beliefs.
nothing productive happening out of it. It's just people pushing their own agenda. That's all there is.
So I believe that yes, like Cambridge Analytica plays, like companies like that plays a big part in
For sure.
undermining our democracy,
Hmm.
but also the rise of these
Hmm.
very
And
extremist groups on the
and if you
internet.
really think about the end of the day, what you see, where you get to get like be shown, it's all controlled by AI at the end of the day as well.
Mhm.
And that obviously is going to produce a bias because it knows what you like and it knows what it's going to push to you.
Yeah, that's true. So, also the impacts of bias can be seen in weapons of mass destruction. Cathy O'Neill says that there is an increase in inequality, there is an erosion of trust in institutions. So, if we want to go in details into the increased inequality, we can see that there's an economic inequalities if you're using biased algorithms. So, the book discusses how algorithms in finance, such as credit scoring models, can disproportionately disadvantage low-income and minority groups. And this creates a vicious cycle where these groups struggle to access fair credits and basically perpetuates economic disparities.
Mhm.
Also, there is the educational disparities that's part of the increased inequality. So the book highlights and examines the algorithms in education, such as those used in the college admissions for to evaluate teachers' performance. These algorithms can often reinforce existing inequalities in the education system, disadvantaging students from less privileged backgrounds. Also, the last example about increased inequality is the workforce segregation. And just like there is the automated hiring algorithms and workplace performance evaluation, those can be influenced by biases a lot, which leads to a segregated workforce and limiting upward mobility for marginalized groups. The other portion is the erosion of trust in institutions. So, weapons of mass destruction talks about how criminal justice system uh, is now treated as a biased predictive policing and sentencing algorithms, and those erode trust in the justice system itself. So, especially among minorities, communities that are affected by these biases. So now there is people who mistrust our court system.
Mhm.
Next, we have the transparency and accountability issues. So O'Neill brings out the concern that the lack of transparency and accountability in algorithmic decision making, for example, is the opacity of those algorithms, can lead to general mistrust in institutions. And the last one is the democratic processes. The use of those algorithms in political advertising and news feeds on social media can influence public opinions and political polarization. And that's something you guys talked about previously as well.
Mhm.
So those are the points of impact of bias that is brought up in the weapons of mass destruction. Do you guys want to add on that, or do we move to the other point? What do you guys think?
I just want to bring up something about the little opacity thing that you said.
Okay.
It's just interesting to me that like you basically as like people or like outsiders
Mm,
who never get access to this model will essentially never know if a
mm,
model is inherently biased unless we kind
mm,
of, I guess, do research with data
Yes.
provided. And I think that's very dangerous as well because you're
mm,
at the same time we introduce a lot of these technologies without any proper justification of technology, and we kind of experiment on people, which is very unethical and morally wrong.
Yes, and especially in the criminal justice system, where
Yeah.
transparency is very important. We need
mm,
transparency in how we're prosecuted, because we don't want people who are innocent and didn't commit crimes to go
Mhm.
to jail
mm,
for no reason,
Mhm.
and we definitely want people who committed crimes to be punished and go to
Mhm.
jail
mm,
for justice to be served. And the lack of transparency completely erodes this, not only the system itself, but also the trust, because
Mhm.
mm,
now public opinion doesn't trust the judicial system, and
mm,
it's not a good thing.
Mhm.
But yeah, like I really agree how more transparency in
mm,
how, at the very least, more transparency in how these algorithms
Mhm.
are being made and how they're being trained in what data
Mhm.
would increase their reliability, and also it would increase the public
mm,
trust in these systems.
Mhm.
um, the over reliance on these technologies without proper transparency really is eroding
mm.
Mhm.
the trust of the public in
Mhm.
the government and the judicial system.
Yeah, so this leads us to the next point, the perpetuation of bias and its reinforcement. So we talked previously about the feedback loop, but to put it simple, it's a circle of events where one event leads to another, where the last event brings back to the first event. That's a feedback loop. But specifically, we're talking about the positive feedback loop, or a special kind of feedback loop that grows bigger or more intense the more you are using it. So
Mm-hmm.
think of a rolling snowball down a hill, right? It starts out small,
Mm-hmm.
but in order for it to grow and even go faster, it will have to pick up more snow. And the more it becomes bigger, it picks up more snow. That's a small analogy to understand a positive feedback loop. And uh, the weapons of mass destruction talks about the feedback loops in two instances. The first one is the criminal justice system. The book discusses how the predictive policing algorithm can create those feedback loops, and by deploying more police to areas predicted to have more crimes, it is often uh, that is often based on biases and historical data. So those algorithms lead to more arrests in those areas again,
Mhm.
and thus reinforcing the data that those algorithms are using, and that's a part of a positive feedback loop. Another
Yes.
one is the employment and economic opportunity. So the algorithms used in hiring or loan approvals can grow economic disparities. If an algorithm denies opportunities based on zip codes or schools that correlate with minority groups, it reinforces the cycle of poverty and inequality.
Mhm.
Yes.
This also like the criminal justice system was also talked about in the Race After Technology book, my book, and it talks about the same issues. So there is a content creation and echo chambers that happen with those algorithms. Uh, so it's basically relates back on how social media algorithms create curate content that users engage with at most. So that's part of how feedback loops is introduced in the book as well. And lastly, Race After Technology book talks about the racial stereotypes and representation. So Benjamin highlights how biases in social media algorithms can lead to racial stereotypes. For instance, the type of content recommended or the way certain groups are portrayed on social media, and that can perpetuate harmful stereotypes and entrenching social divides. Um, so we we could move on to the next point, talk about how the challenging and mitigation in biased algorithms. So I'm gonna start with. But first of all, you guys told me that you had an article that helps and talks about 3 steps
Mhm. Yes.
to mitigate bias.
It
So
wasn't
what?
more so bias, it's more so just like algorithmic risks. So, and I
Mm,
think bias is a part of it.
mm,
So, essentially, Ben Schneiderman, who is the author of The Dangers of Faulty Bias or Malicious Algorithms, basically, he produces a 3 step sort of plan so that it starts with planning oversight, which is that developers basically are required to submit like an impact statement, basically explaining how their algorithms can impact society and other parts. They basically document things such as program goals, data quality, and just outputs that they could address basically.
Mhm.
Then we have just a continuous sort of monitoring, and what this is basically someone from the outside comes and basically sort of monitors what you're doing so that there's no bias introduced. And these people are often switched out as well,
mm,
so that again, if one person's just looking at something over and over, there's obviously gonna be some bias there because we're
mm,
just human at the end of the day. And so they keep these guys in rotation so that there's obviously no bias introduced, and that so that these
mm,
algorithms can like work um, despite anything else.
mm,
And lastly, the last point that he brings up is retrospective analysis of disasters. So, in the case of something going wrong or a disaster happening, it's always important to go back and to fix what happens.
mm,
And that's something that the author points as being very important because without this, you're going to keep the same problems, and these problems will lead to other problems. And there definitely needs to be some sort of formation so that these problems don't arise again.
yeah.
And that's essentially just how they could lower the risk
Of
algorithmic
bias.
risks, and that does it with bias for sure.
Yeah, so I did find an article that kind of overlaps on the points that you made. The article was posted by the Brookings Institution, and it is a very highly reputable and nonprofit public policy organization based in Washington, D.C. It is one of the oldest and most respected think tanks in the world, and it's renowned for research and education on a wide range of domestic and foreign policy issues. And specifically in this article, talks about few steps that we can take to mitigate bias in algorithms. For example, it starts with diverse data and teams. So we are ensuring that diversity in the data used to train algorithms and the teams that create and manage them help reduce the biases. Then we have regular audits. So regularly auditing algorithms for bias and accuracy can catch and correct issues over time. Next, we have transparency and accountability. Making the workings of algorithms transparent uh, and holding creators accountable for biases help maintain trust and fairness. We have then ethical and responsible AI development and encouraging ethical practices in AI development, including consideration of potential biases, is very crucial. Uh, we also have the regulation and policy, so implement policies and regulations to guide fair and unbiased AI development is very important. Community engagement, so we're engaging with affected communities to provide valuable insights into potential biases and their impacts. And lastly is the consumer education, so educating consumers about how algorithms work and their potential biases, empowering them to make informed decisions. So those, I feel like some of those points are overlapping with the article that you brought up. Uh, do you think there is other ways that we can mitigate biases? I feel like what we learned in the course as data scientists,
Mm-hmm.
we are learning about ethical algorithms, right? So when we move on to the workforce, do you think we should apply those heavily, or like does it really matter if we apply those unbiased ethics checks or not?
I think it's important to apply ethical checks for sure, because if you don't have ethical checks, you'll have examples of what the main the main character of Code of Bias went through, where she couldn't recognize her, they couldn't recognize her face, so they weren't. And I'm guessing that was from like an unethical viewpoint,
Mhm.
where they didn't fully keep track of everything. I think if they were to change to an ethical viewpoint, they would have kept track of all these issues.
Mhm. Uh, Now that we move to the next point, so how can we call it to action as computer scientists? Do you guys think that the consumers have like to be extra aware of those biases? Do you think consumers can
I
add or
think
remove biases as well?
I think it's everyone. Honestly, I think everyone plays a
Yeah.
part in this. It
Mm,
can't just be left to the consumers or just the programmers themselves. I think everyone in society plays a part towards the data collected. Because again, it's all data that we kind of give out
mm,
because all that's connected to our phones and stuff like that.
Yes. And I think the more that we have awareness of how biases can affect us personally, I think the more there's going to be calls for actions from the general public, for
Mm-hmm.
large corporations especially,
Mm-hmm.
and education institutions
Mm-hmm.
perhaps, to change how they do business, or for the case of
Mm-hmm.
institution,
And
what they're teaching. And I think also when it comes to the workforce especially, businesses are not going to change just for the
well-being.
um, just for the idea. They are
mm,
going to change because there's money involved,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a business issue that they have to
mm,
address. And when the general public is aware of certain biases and how they can
mm,
affect them personally, I think they're going to want products that are not going to perpetuate these kind of biases, and they're going to be more aware of
Mm-hmm.
those.
mhm,
Then that's when companies are going to make a shift into being more careful
mm,
about our private data and what the companies are doing with our sensitive information.
mm.
I think just the important thing again is that these companies sort of be more opaque with it. Or
Yeah,
sorry, be not
Mm.
more open with it. Sorry,
transparent.
Transparency,
transparent. Sorry,
yes.
that's
Yes.
the word. Because if they don't relay these problems to us, we're going to be assuming that they work completely fine,
Mm-hmm.
and that would reinforce a lot of biases within our society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I feel like the transparency point that you bring up is the most important.
For sure.
Not only us as
Yes.
computer scientists, even consumers can even advocate
Yes.
big corporations
Mhm.
to provide how are those algorithms being deployed, how are they
Mhm.
being trained, and
Because for me, before I even started the course, I was not aware that algorithms were being employed to decide whether you are likely to reoffend or
Mhm,
not. And for me personally, I'm thinking like, what if I'm accused of a crime that I didn't do? And of course, we want a fair trial to decide, okay, like I didn't
mhm,
actually commit the crime. This is important for the justice system. But what if I'm accused of a crime and then this algorithm says, oh, like I was from the specific uh,
mhm. Neighborhood.
neighborhood that
Mhm.
raised my risk?
And I think even that itself is a black box as well. I don't think it
Mhm,
would even go into so much detail to even tell you why it made such a
mhm.
decision.
Like
Yeah,
I,
it's
I
just building on historical data,
Mhm.
nothing that we can see or like
Mhm.
even comment on. So the
To
we're
kind
just
of
being affected by the outcome, but we
come
cannot even put anything into the input of those
for
algorithms.
but
sure.
I think with increased awareness and transparency of how these algorithms
Mhm,
work, people would be more aware of like the general situation of like, for example, of course, people are going to think, well, okay, what if I'm the one who's in the shoe of
mhm,
someone who's accused of a crime that they didn't commit, and then this algorithm just decided, well, you're from this specific neighborhood, and there's some certain biases that affected your score of
mhm,
reoffending, which now gets you placed in jail until
mhm,
your trial. And this really mentally impacts people, right? Even if they're
mhm,
not guilty of that crime, they might be more likely to be sentenced of that crime because their mental capabilities are not able to deal with the situation within the confinement of a jail, because of
Mhm.
course that is traumatizing when you are accused of a crime you didn't commit, and then you're also stuck in jail.
For sure, it's a worst case
So,
scenario.
and people would think about these kind of situation, and they would make calls for actions on more transparency and
Mhm.
awareness on these kind of situations, not just for the criminal justice system, any kind of places where we're using AI, but I think also like the justice system is a
Mhm.
big example.
All right, just to wrap up, so this episode we talked about bias. We introduced our books again. That was the start of the podcast. Then we talked about the nature of algorithm bias. Then we talked about the manifestation of algorithmic bias in social media. We went on to talk about the impact of bias in society and democracy. We then went to the perpetuation of bias and its reinforcement, and we talked about the positive feedback loop there. We went to the challenges of mitigating bias in algorithms. And this kind of wraps up the bias podcast. But episode one, we talked about the social media algorithms. And in this episode, we talked about bias. So just to tease the final episode where we actually finally answer the question is social media controlling us? Do you guys think that, just a quick, like 1 minute answer, you guys think that we are very, very affected by it? Like, do we have a choice of not being affected by it?
I think social media controls every part of our life. There are times where even me, for example, I'll be going out somewhere and I'll even get like a little message from my phone or something.
Mhm.
I'll be inclined to look at it right away.
Okay.
And I think that's not just me. I feel like that's indicative of a lot of society. I feel like many people are just glued to their phones now.
Mhm.
And again, since AIs are basically making a decision on what we see, we're kind of at their will essentially.
Mhm.
What I will say for myself is that everybody nowadays has a phone,
Mhm.
or the vast majority of people have a phone. And a phone is a smart device that has access to the internet and
For sure. It's an agent of
processor.
surveillance.
Mhm.
And these devices can definitely be used for any kind of surveillance or, you know,
Data
create
Targeted
collection,
advertising.
data collection.
yeah, targeted advertisement, data collection, all of these things to perpetuate biases.
Mhm.
So I'm not going to answer the question myself, but I think
Mhm.
that this really directs my position on the subject.
All right, and of course, we're gonna go more in details in the next episode.
Mhm.
This will wrap up this episode. Again,
Mhm.
thank you for listening,
Thank you very much for
Thank
listening.
you.
and forgive us if we made any mistakes. Again, we did not
Yes.
have feedback from episode one, so we're operating blindly so far. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.